Lorraine and I carved out a beautiful life together in a quiet, well-heeled suburb of Houston. Our home was our haven, a sprawling place we paid off entirely through our own sweat and sacrifice. We raised our only son, Derek, giving him everything he could ever want or need. We covered his college, stood by him when he wed Nadine, and always kept ourselves in the background as the steady, supportive parents. 3 weeks ago, my whole world fell apart. Welcome to His Hidden Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, I'd love for you to follow along so you never miss what comes next. While you're settling in, drop a comment and let me know what you're up to. Right now, are you driving somewhere, cooking in the kitchen, resting after a long day, or just stealing a quiet moment for yourself? I'd genuinely love to know. A quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped and dramatized for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to specific real persons or events is entirely coincidental. It's the truth at the heart of the story that I want you to carry with you. Lorraine passed away after a short but savage fight with illness. Losing her felt like someone had reached in and stolen the air from my lungs. The house became suddenly too large and unbearably silent. Derek and Nadine came by for the funeral, said the things people say at those moments, then slipped back into their own lives, leaving me to suffocate alone inside the emptiness of that home. I spent my days drifting from room to room, running my hands over the furniture she had chosen, breathing in the perfume that still hung faintly in the air, trying to work out how a man lives the rest of his life without his compass. Then last Tuesday morning, my phone rang. On the other end was an attorney from a very old, very prestigious law firm in downtown Houston. He asked me to come to his office right away regarding a private matter Lorraine had arranged years ago. I was baffled. Lorraine and I had shared everything. No secrets existed between us. Every Sunday we sat together at the kitchen table and managed our finances side by side. But I put on a suit, drove into the city, and settled into a leather chair across from a man who slid a small brass key across the desk. It belonged, he told me, to a safe deposit box at a private bank just 2 blocks away. The box was held in Lorraine's name, but I was listed as the sole beneficiary upon her passing. I walked to that bank carrying a strange mixture of anxiety and curiosity. The vault manager led me into a quiet, secure room lined with metal walls and left me alone with a heavy steel box. My hands were actually trembling as I turned the key and raised the lid. I fully expected old love letters inside, perhaps some family heirlooms, or vintage jewelry she had set aside for safekeeping. What I found instead were stacks of neatly bound $100 bills, $400,000 in raw cash. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared down at it. But that wasn't all. Beneath the cash sat a thick manila envelope holding a legal deed and a handwritten letter from my wife. I unfolded it, recognizing Lorraine's elegant handwriting the instant my eyes landed on the page. The ink was slightly faded, written perhaps a decade ago. In that letter, Lorraine laid out everything. The money and the deed belonged to a massive 5,000-acre ranch in Montana. It was a secret inheritance from her estranged father. I had always known her father was a difficult, toxic man who used his wealth as a weapon to control the people around him. Lorraine had cut ties with him long before we ever met. What I hadn't known was that when he died, he left his entire estate to her. She wrote that she had kept this wealth hidden from me and from Derek because she wanted to shield our family from the corrosive pull of unearned money. She wanted Derek to grow up grounded, to understand the value of hard work and carve out his own life without standing around waiting for a handout. She wanted our marriage built on love and partnership, not on the burden of managing a vast fortune. The most stunning part was a secondary document attached to the deed. The Montana ranch wasn't sitting idle. It was currently leased to a major mineral and natural gas corporation. That land was quietly generating $50,000 every single month in royalties money that had been flowing into a private trust for years, completely untouched. I sat in that quiet metal room for well over an hour, utterly overwhelmed. Lorraine had carried that enormous secret to preserve the humble, honest life we had built together. She was the most remarkable woman I had ever known. Tears ran down my face as I pressed her letter against my chest. I felt profound gratitude, but beneath it a deep, aching sorrow that she wasn't here to share any of this with me. Eventually, I pulled myself together. I placed the documents and the cash carefully into my leather briefcase, walked out of the bank, and got into my car. As I drove back to the suburbs, my mind ran wild with possibilities. The grief was still there, bearing down on my shoulders, but now I had a new sense of purpose. My thoughts turned to Derek and Nadine. I knew they'd been grumbling lately about the rising cost of living and the weight of the mortgage on their house. I thought about how much this could do for them. I could wipe out their debts. We could take that long family trip to Europe, the one Lorraine had always dreamed about, and I could set up trust funds for future grandchildren. I turned onto my quiet suburban street, eager to share the bittersweet discovery. I pulled into the driveway and looked up at the beautiful brick facade of the $1.2 million home Lorraine and I had lovingly kept over the years. But walking up the drive, I spotted a large unmarked box truck parked near the side entrance. The front door was propped wide open. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I gripped my briefcase and stepped through the doorway. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Three men I didn't recognize were inside my living room, aggressively yanking my antique paintings off the walls and wrapping them in the thick, moving blankets. Others were breaking down the heavy oak dining table, where Lorraine and I had hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the last 30 years. The house was in absolute chaos. Boxes crammed with my belongings were stacked throughout the hallway. And standing right in the center of the living room, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the movers, were my son Derek and his wife Nadine. I stood there for a moment, invisible, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My own flesh and blood was tearing apart my home without a single word of warning. The elation of the Montana ranch evaporated in an instant, replaced by the chilling understanding that my perfect family had been a complete illusion. I cleared my throat loudly. Derek turned around, his eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before a smooth, rehearsed smile spread across his face. He had no idea what was inside my briefcase, and he had absolutely no idea that he had just declared war on a man who had nothing left to lose. I stood frozen in the entryway of my own house, my polished leather shoes glued to the hardwood floor, watching three burly men in gray uniforms haul my things toward the door. One of them was wrestling with a gilded mirror that Lorraine and I had purchased on our 10th anniversary in Galveston. Another was carelessly stuffing my antique mahogany mantel clock into a thick layer of industrial plastic wrap. The hand-woven Turkish kilim rug that usually tied the whole living room together was already rolled up and shoved into a dark corner. The entire house looked like it had been turned inside out. And standing right in the thick of it all, pointing and directing the movers like a seasoned project manager, was my son Derek, wearing his expensive tailored chinos and a pressed chambray shirt, looking perfectly relaxed, while dismantling the sanctuary his mother and I had spent a lifetime building. Nadine appeared from the kitchen holding a steaming cup of coffee. She had on a sharp ivory blazer and carried herself as though she already owned the place and was simply staging it for an open house. She did not look like a woman grieving her beloved mother-in-law. She looked deeply satisfied. I tightened my grip on the handle of my leather briefcase. Inside sat $400,000 in raw cash and the legal key to a future they knew absolutely nothing about. I cleared my throat loudly. Derek spun around. For just a fraction of a second, sheer panic flashed across his eyes. Then the smooth, rehearsed smile appeared, the exact expression he used when he was trying to sell a bad financial deal to a wealthy client at his firm. "Dad," Derek said, his voice coated in an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "We didn't expect you back from the city so soon. I thought you told us you were going to be out all afternoon dealing with the estate lawyers." "What exactly is going on here, Derek?" I asked, holding my voice dangerously steady despite the rage boiling in my chest. "Why are there strange men in my house taking down my wife's paintings without my permission?" Nadine glided over and took her place right beside him. "Gerald, please try to stay calm," she said, deliberately pitching her voice so every mover in the room could hear. It was a calculated move designed to make me look like an unstable, emotional old man, losing his grip on reality. "We are just trying to help you. We know how incredibly hard these past 3 weeks have been since Lorraine passed away." "Help me?" I repeated, sweeping my gaze across the devastated living room. "You are actively dismantling my home, Nadine, the house I paid off with 40 years of hard work on the oil rigs." Derek let out a heavy sigh, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive posture. He walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up a glossy, colorful brochure, holding it out to me with a look of profound manufactured pity that made my stomach physically turn. "We need to be completely realistic here, Dad," Derek said softly, stepping a few inches closer. "You are 70 years old now. You are living alone in a massive 5-bedroom house. The daily upkeep is simply too much for one person to manage. The memories inside these walls are clearly weighing you down and breaking your heart. You have been drifting around like a lost ghost since Mom died. It is simply not safe for you to be here on your own anymore. He slid the brochure smoothly across the coffee table surface. I looked down at it. The cover showed a group of sad elderly people seated in wheelchairs on a patchy dying lawn. The bold letters across the top read Creekside Manor Care Center. This was no luxury retirement community. It was a low-income state-run nursing home, a bleak bare-bones facility where selfish families disposed of their elderly relatives when they no longer wanted to shoulder the burden of caring for them. "We have decided it is time, Dad." Derek went on, his tone hardening just a fraction, the false warmth draining away. "We are selling your house. It is the absolute best thing for your health and your long-term future." Nadine stepped up right behind him, resting her perfectly manicured hands on his shoulders. She flashed me a cold, calculated smirk, a look of absolute, undeniable triumph. She genuinely believed she had won the grand prize. She was convinced she was dealing with a broken, grieving widower who would simply crumble under their pressure and quietly sign away his entire life. For one brief, foolish moment, I actually felt a wave of deep pity for them both. I looked at my only son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway, the boy I had sat up with late into the night, working through difficult math homework. I found myself wondering how much crushing debt they must be hiding to sink to something this vile. I wondered what degree of financial ruin had driven them to try and steal my home right out from under me. My grip on the leather briefcase loosened slightly. I realized I held the power to resolve this entire situation, right here, right now. There was $400,000 in raw cash sitting in my hand. I could pay off their suffocating mortgage without breaking a sweat. I could clear whatever hidden debts were drowning them in desperation. I could hand them a clean slate and a genuine fresh start. All I had to do was open the briefcase, show them the legal deed to the Montana ranch, and tell them that everything was going to be all right. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to smile, preparing to be the forgiving and generous father who rides to the rescue one last time. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell them about Lorraine's extraordinary secret, to tell them about the $50,000 a month in mineral royalties that would secure our family for generations. But before those words could leave my throat, my gaze drifted back down to the glass coffee table. Sitting right beside that deeply insulting nursing home brochure was a thick stack of legal documents. They were partially covered by a plain manila folder, but the top page was fully exposed under the bright living room lights. It was a standard state legal form, and the bold black letters at the very top read, "Durable Power of Attorney." My breath caught sharply in my throat. I moved closer, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense text on the page. It granted full, unconditional legal control of my personal finances, my medical decisions, and my real estate holdings directly to Derek. It gave him the legal authority to sell my home, drain my bank accounts, and have me committed to a psychiatric facility against my will. But that was not what made my blood run completely cold. At the bottom of the page, right beside a bright red official notary seal, was my signature, a perfect, flawless forgery of my own handwriting. The hopeful smile died on my lips instantly. The fatherly pity I'd been feeling evaporated into thin air, replaced entirely by an icy, terrible clarity. They weren't simply trying to pressure me into selling my home through emotional manipulation. They had already stolen it behind my back. They had committed serious federal fraud to legally strip away my rights, my financial independence, and my basic human dignity. I slowly raised my eyes from the forged document and locked onto my son's gaze. Derek was no longer wearing his fake, reassuring smile. He could see exactly what I was looking at. He watched the dark realization wash violently across my face. But rather than apologizing, rather than showing even a trace of human guilt, he held my stare with a cold, defiant challenge in his eyes. They thought I was weak. They thought my grief had left me permanently blinded and helpless. But they had absolutely no idea what was hidden inside my briefcase. And they had no idea whatsoever what a man who has lost his beloved wife and his only son in the very same month is truly capable of doing to protect everything he has built. I kept my eyes fixed on Derek for a long, agonizing moment before I slowly raised my hand and pointed a trembling finger at the glass coffee table. I made sure to let it shake, playing perfectly into the story they had already constructed about me. I needed them to believe I was just a confused, overwhelmed old man who was completely out of his depth. Derek, I said, letting my voice waver just enough to sound vulnerable. What exactly is that document right there next to the nursing home brochure? Why does it carry my signature? I have absolutely no memory of signing any legal papers since your mother passed away. The tension in the living room shifted in an instant. The defiant challenge in Derek's eyes vanished, replaced by frantic, silent calculation. He shot a glance at Nadine, asking her without a word to take the lead. Nadine didn't miss a beat. The cruel, triumphant smirk she'd been wearing just moments ago melted away with frightening speed. In the blink of an eye, she transformed into a portrait of warm, genuine empathy. Her posture softened, her shoulders dropped, and she released a long, sympathetic sigh that sounded so convincingly real, it almost made me doubt my own mind. She crossed to the coffee table with slow, measured steps, steering clear of the forged power of attorney entirely. Instead, she reached for a thick, unmarked manila folder that had been lying just beneath it. She lifted it carefully, clutching it to her chest as she came toward me. Her dark eyes were brimming with manufactured sorrow. "Gerald, we did not want to have this conversation this way," Nadine murmured softly, reaching out to rest a hand gently on my forearm. I had to force myself not to pull back from her touch. "We were trying to spare you the pain of confronting the harsh reality of your current medical situation." "My medical situation?" I repeated, furrowing my brow in deliberate confusion. "I am perfectly healthy. My heart is strong, and my blood pressure is completely normal. What on earth are you talking about?" Nadine, she opened the manila folder and drew out a stack of crisp hospital records. I recognized the official letterhead. Immediately, it was from the same private hospital where Lorraine had spent her final days. Nadine flipped to the third page and handed it to me, with an expression of deep theatrical sadness. "We spoke to Dr. Calloway on the day Lorraine passed," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle, hushed whisper. "He was very concerned about you, Gerald. He pulled Derek aside in the hallway and asked him to keep a close eye on your deteriorating mental state." I looked down at the document in my trembling hands. It was a genuine medical chart, stamped and dated by Lorraine's primary physician. But near the bottom of the page, highlighted in bright yellow marker, was a handwritten note added to the margins. It read, "Patient's husband is showing severe signs of grief-induced cognitive decline. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation and full-time supervision to prevent accidental self-harm." I stared at those highlighted words, my mind racing to understand how they had managed to obtain something so damning. Dr. Calloway was a busy man. I had barely exchanged a word with him during Lorraine's final hours. I was too consumed with holding her fragile hand and praying for a miracle. Derek must have cornered him somewhere in that chaotic hospital corridor, spinning a tragic tale about an unstable, weeping father who was coming completely apart at the seams. They had planted the seed of my insanity before my beloved wife was even cold in her hospital bed. Before I could begin to process the sheer depth of that betrayal, Derek stepped forward and took firm hold of both my hands. His grip was tight, almost restraining, as though he were trying to physically anchor me to the hardwood floor. He looked directly into my eyes, and for just a fleeting second, I almost believed the overwhelming sorrow written across his face. He was a remarkably gifted liar. "Dad, you have to listen to us," Derek pleaded, his voice cracking with rehearsed emotion. "You are not well. The grief has completely shattered your mind. You simply do not see how bad things have gotten over these last 3 agonizing weeks." "I am fine," I protested weakly, playing my pitiful role to perfection. "I am simply mourning your beautiful mother. That is perfectly natural for a man who just lost his entire world." "It is not just mourning Dad," Derek pressed, squeezing my hands tighter. "You have been roaming around this house in the dead of night talking to the walls. Last Tuesday, Nadine came by to drop off some groceries and found the front door standing wide open with the gas stove left burning on high. You could have burned the whole house down, Dad. You have almost completely stopped eating unless we physically set food down right in front of you. You are slipping away from us, and I cannot stand the thought of losing you right after losing Mom." I stared at my son in pure disbelief. Not a single word of it was even remotely true. I had never left the stove on. I had never left the front door hanging open. I had been perfectly capable of preparing my own meals and keeping to my daily routine. They were actively constructing a fabricated history building, an airtight legal narrative of my rapid mental collapse. They were gaslighting me inside my own living room, steadily tightening an invisible noose around my neck. I honestly do not remember any of that happening, I whispered, letting my gaze drop to the floor and projecting the pitiable image of a confused, shattered old man. We know you do not remember Gerald. Nadine chimed in, stepping closer to rub my back in slow, soothing circles. That is precisely why we had to step in when we did. That is why we had to take control of the situation before you accidentally hurt yourself. I slowly looked back up at the glass coffee table, pointing a shaking finger at the forged document one more time. But my signature, I did not sign that paper, Derek. I would never in my life sign away my entire existence without reading every word. Derek released my trembling hands and drew a long, steadying breath. His expression shifted with practiced precision into one of profound, unwavering nobility. He stood tall, projecting the image of a devoted son making a painful sacrifice for the well-being of his aging father. We forged it to spare you the stress of the paperwork, Dad. Derek confessed quietly, his voice ringing with complete, unapologetic conviction in the hollow silence of the living room. We are selling the house to get you into a round-the-clock luxury care facility where you will be completely and utterly safe. We are simply protecting you. The words left his mouth, and my brain refused to process them for a long moment. We forged it to spare you the stress. We are simply protecting you. The audacity of the lie was so immense, so breathtakingly hollow, that a surge of pure rage ignited in my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach across that glass coffee table, grab the collar of his expensive chambray shirt, and hurl him out of my house. I wanted to pull the $400,000 from my briefcase and fling it into his lying face and watch his world collapse. But I did not move a single muscle. I am a retired petroleum engineer. My entire career was built on maintaining absolute composure during high-pressure blowouts on offshore drilling rigs. When combustible gas floods the air, you do not panic. You assess the structural integrity of the system, locate the lethal points of failure, and execute a precise sequence to survive the explosion. Right now, I was staring down a catastrophic blowout. If I fought them on the spot, I would lose everything. Derek had just revealed the ultimate weapon. He had a medical document bearing a legitimate doctor's signature, declaring that I was suffering from severe grief-induced cognitive decline. If I raised my voice, if I showed anger, if I called the police to report the forgery, Nadine would use that anger as immediate proof of my instability. They would contact the authorities, produce the highlighted note, and use the forged power of attorney to haul me out of my own home. I would be locked inside a psychiatric ward before sundown, stripped of every right I possessed. I understood with terrifying clarity that I was cornered. The only path through this trap was to make them believe it had worked perfectly. I had to play the fool. I had to become the exact pitiful, broken version of myself they so desperately needed me to be. I let out a long, trembling breath, making sure it landed like a sigh of complete defeat. I deliberately let my posture cave, shoulders rounding forward, as if the weight of my grief had finally become too much for my bones to carry. I dropped my chin-broke eye contact with Derek and fixed my stare blankly on the floorboards. I let my hands fall to my sides, my grip on the leather briefcase loosening just enough to look entirely harmless. "You really think this is for the best, Derek?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and thin, lacing it with a frail, wavering note of bewilderment. "You truly believe I cannot take care of myself anymore?" Derek seized the opening without hesitation. He placed both hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and patronizing. "I know it is hard to hear, Dad. But yes, we genuinely believe this is the only way to keep you safe. You need professional care. The facility we found is wonderful. You will be comfortable, and you will not have to worry about maintaining this enormous empty house anymore. Let us handle all the complicated paperwork. You just need to rest and find some peace," Nadine added, her voice dripping with that same artificial cloying sweetness. "We will pack up your essential things and a few nice photographs of Lorraine to bring with you to your new room, Gerald. You do not need to lift a finger. We have everything completely under control." I nodded slowly and deliberately, making my movements sluggish and uncertain. I lifted a trembling hand to my face and rubbed my eyes, mimicking the exhausted gesture of a man overwhelmed beyond his limits. "I am just so tired," I mumbled, letting my words blur together slightly. "I am so incredibly tired, Derek. I miss your mother so much. Nothing makes any sense without her." "We know, Dad," Derek said, patting my shoulder with hollow, mechanical affection. Go to your room and lie down. We will finish up with the movers and handle the rest of the packing out here. We will come and get you when dinner is ready." I gave one final slow nod, turned and began to shuffle down the long hallway toward my master bedroom. I dragged my feet across the hardwood, making sure every step sounded heavy and thoroughly defeated. Every fiber of my being burned to spin around and fight, but my mind kept my body locked in character. I reached my bedroom door, pushed it open, stepped inside, and eased it shut behind me. The instant the latch clicked, the frail, confused old man disappeared entirely. I straightened up, my breathing controlled and my mind sharp as a blade. I quietly turned the lock and placed my leather briefcase securely in the bottom drawer of my heavy oak dresser, burying it beneath a thick pile of winter sweaters. I settled on the edge of the mattress and listened to the muffled sounds of the movers dismantling the rest of my home. I could hear furniture being dragged heavily across the floor. I could hear Nadine issuing crisp, commanding orders, her counterfeit sweetness fully replaced by her natural tone of cold authority. I sat there in the fading afternoon light, working through every possible angle of my defense. I needed hard evidence. I needed to uncover the real reason they were scrambling to liquidate a $1 million asset. The forged power of attorney and the sudden nursing home story were the moves of desperate people, and people only resort to desperate, deeply illegal measures when they are backed into a terrifying financial corner. I knew Derek. I knew he was arrogant and sloppy. He would leave a digital trail, a paper trail, or let something slip in conversation. I just needed to find it. I stayed in my bedroom for the rest of the evening. When Nadine eventually knocked on the door and offered me a plate of bland, unseasoned baked cod and steamed vegetables, I accepted it with a weak, grateful smile, keeping my performance flawless. I left most of the food untouched, reinforcing their belief that I was rapidly declining. Night eventually came down over the chaotic, half-empty house like a heavy blanket of silence. Derek and Nadine had decided to sleep in the guest room to keep watch over the property and presumably to keep watch over me. I lay awake for hours staring up at the dark ceiling, my mind turning over legal strategies and potential countermeasures. At around 2 in the morning, my throat had gone bone dry. I carefully pulled back the heavy blankets and swung my legs over the side of the bed. I left the lights off. I knew the layout of my own home perfectly, even in complete darkness. I moved silently down the long hallway toward the kitchen in my bare feet. The house felt hollowed out without the familiar furniture filling every room. I reached the kitchen and quietly filled a glass with cold tap water. As I raised it to my lips, a faint flickering light caught the corner of my eye. I lowered the glass and looked through the large bay window that overlooked the back patio. Standing outside in the cool night air, lit only by the harsh blue glow of her smartphone screen, was Nadine. She was pacing back and forth across the stone paver's arms, crossing and uncrossing in rapid, agitated movements, whispering hard into her phone and glancing over her shoulder every few seconds to make sure she was completely alone. I set the glass down on the counter without a sound and leaned in close to the window to watch her. I could not make out every word through the glass, but I could read the body language clearly enough. This was not a casual late-night call. Something was burning. I stayed perfectly still, watching her pace that patio for nearly 20 minutes. When she finally slipped back inside through the side door, I retreated silently to my bedroom. I eased the door shut and stood in the darkness, piecing together what I had just witnessed. Whatever financial disaster was driving them, Nadine was at the center of it. She was the one making the calls, managing the pressure, running the operation. Derek was the face, charming, rehearsed, performing the role of devoted son. But Nadine was the architect. She always had been. I had simply chosen for years to look the other way. I climbed back into bed and pulled the blankets up. I knew I needed to sleep, but my mind refused to slow down. I thought about everything: the forged signature, the medical chart, the stack of moving boxes filling my hallway. I thought about Lorraine's letter folded inside that briefcase in the dresser drawer. I thought about the Montana ranch and what $50,000 a month in royalties truly meant in the hands of someone who understood how to use it. They thought they were stripping me of my power, but they had no idea that in the very same afternoon they were busy dismantling my home. I had quietly come into possession of more financial leverage than they could dream of. I had spent 40 years working high-pressure blowouts on offshore drilling rigs. I had survived equipment failures that killed men standing 10 feet away from me. I had made critical decisions in seconds with combustible gas filling the air around me. This my arrogant son and his scheming wife staging a takeover of an old man's home was not going to be the thing that broke me. I needed to be methodical. I needed documentation of the forgery. I needed an attorney of my own, one Derek and Dean knew nothing about. I needed to understand exactly how deep their debt went and precisely who else was involved. And I needed to do all of it while continuing to perform the role of a confused, grieving old man who was slipping gently out of his grip on reality. I finally drifted off sometime before dawn, my plan beginning to take shape in the quiet dark. When I opened my eyes the next morning, thin gray light was pressing through the curtains. I lay still for a moment, listening. I could hear Nadine's voice somewhere down the hall, already alert and already giving instructions. I sat up, slowly moving, with the exaggerated stiffness of someone far more fragile than I actually was. I shuffled to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and studied my reflection in the mirror for a long moment. The man looking back at me had buried his wife 3 weeks ago, had his home invaded by his own son, and had discovered a secret that changed every calculation about his future. He did not look broken. He looked like a man with a plan. I pulled on a plain robe over my pajamas and made my way out into the hallway, dragging my feet just enough to sell the performance. The house was already stirring. 2 of the movers from the previous day had returned and were hauling boxes out through the front entrance. Paintings that had hung on these walls for 30 years were gone, leaving pale rectangular ghosts on the plaster. The hand-woven Turkish kilim rug that usually tied the whole living room together was missing entirely, the floor beneath it, bare and cold. I stood in the doorway of the living room and blinked slowly, letting my mouth hang slightly open in the expression of someone who no longer quite grasps what he is looking at. Derek appeared from around the corner, holding a cup of coffee, and when he saw me, that same smooth, rehearsed smile settled across his face. "Morning, Dad. Did you sleep okay?" "I think so," I said, vaguely rubbing the back of my neck. "I am not entirely sure. I keep losing track of things." Derek nodded with practiced sympathy and steered me gently toward the kitchen table, sitting me down as though I might tip over without assistance. He set a cup of weak tea in front of me. I wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it, giving him absolutely nothing to worry about. Every inch of that house was mapped inside my head. I could have navigated it blindfolded. I eased my bedroom door open without a sound and moved barefoot down the long hallway toward the kitchen. Without the familiar old furniture filling those rooms, the whole place felt hollow, like a body drained of blood. I got to the kitchen and drew a glass of cold water from the tap. Just as I lifted it to my mouth, a faint flickering caught the corner of my eye. I set the glass down slowly and looked out through the large bay window that faced the backyard patio. There was Nadine standing outside in the cool darkness, her face lit up by nothing but the harsh blue glow of her smartphone screen. She was moving back and forth across the stone paver's arms, folding and unfolding in sharp, restless bursts. She was whispering hard into the phone, throwing glances over her shoulder every few seconds to confirm she was completely alone. I flattened myself against the cool plaster of the kitchen wall and held my breath until my chest burned. She was right there, just on the other side of the glass. The thin moonlight stretched long, distorted shadows across the cold stone below. I lowered my water glass onto the granite counter with extreme care, not so much as a whisper of sound. My gaze stayed locked on my daughter-in-law. Her movements were jagged and entirely unpredictable. The blue light from her screen threw her face into sharp relief, exposing an intense, almost manic look I had never once seen on her during daylight hours. Something was driving her to the edge of panic in the middle of the night, and I had to know what it was. I crept closer to the bay window. The old wooden frame had a slight gap near the bottom latch, a minor flaw I had always meant to get around to fixing. I pressed my fingers against the brass handle and nudged it upward just barely enough to widen that gap by a fraction. The night air slipped into the dark kitchen, at once carrying the faint, muffled current of her hushed voice. I shut my eyes and strained to pull meaning from the fragments drifting in. The words themselves wouldn't come clear. The wind moving through the oak trees kept swallowing the details, but the tone was unmistakable, sharp, aggressive. She was not on the phone with Derek. The rhythm of the conversation was all wrong for that. Her voice swung between something almost pleading and something hard and demanding sometimes, within the same breath. It sounded exactly like a high-stakes negotiation, coming apart at the seams. She dragged a hand through her hair and shook her head at whatever was being said on the other end. Then she cut the call off abruptly, her fingers trembling as she forced the phone deep into her blazer pocket. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, staring out across the dark, manicured lawn, as if she expected something to emerge from the shadows. Then a long, ragged breath left her, and she reached into her other pocket. What she pulled out turned my blood to ice. It was a bright orange plastic bottle, and I knew it immediately. It was the premium memory supplement Nadine had so thoughtfully picked up for me earlier that week. She had placed it in my hands with the warmest smile, explaining that the natural vitamins would help lift the mental fog that grief had settled over me. She had even taken the trouble to buy a weekly pill organizer and sort the capsules herself, so I wouldn't have to worry about keeping track. I stood frozen in horror as she unscrewed the cap. She did not take anything for herself. Instead, she crossed to the far edge of the patio, right where Lorraine used to plant her lavender bushes. Nadine crouched down, opened the bottle, and began pulling the gelatin capsules apart one at a time. She tipped each one over and shook the fine herbal powder out into the dark, damp garden soil, working through them methodically, until a small mound of pale dust lay buried beneath the bushes. My mind was clawing at itself, trying to process what I was seeing. Why would she empty the supplements she had pushed me to take every morning without fail? The answer arrived seconds later, and it was worse than anything I could have imagined. Nadine straightened up and drew a small, clear Ziploc bag from the inner pocket of her blazer. Even from where I stood hidden in the pitch-black kitchen, I could see clearly that the bag held a crushed white powder, nothing like any medication I had ever come across. It looked crude, chalky, wrong in every way. She laid the empty gelatin capsule shells flat on the surface of the patio table and went to work with a chilling, practiced efficiency. She scooped the white powder from the bag and refilled each capsule, packing the unknown substance in tight. Her eyes narrowed in the total concentration. She pressed the two halves of each capsule back together, sealing whatever that substance was inside its innocent shell. Right there in my own backyard, she was constructing something lethal. I watched her wipe the residual white dust from her fingers onto her slacks. Then she picked up the newly loaded capsules and placed them one by one into the compartments of my weekly pill organizer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Every slot filled, every dose made to look exactly like the original herbal vitamins she had replaced. A massive wave of nausea crashed through me as the full, hideous truth finally locked into place. The brain fog, the crushing fatigue, the alarming gaps in my short-term memory over the past 2 weeks of misery. None of it was grief doing what grief does to a person. None of it was my 70-year-old mind buckling under the weight of losing my wife. It was cold, deliberate chemistry. It was poison moving through my body. They were systematically drugging me to manufacture the precise medical symptoms needed to execute their legal takeover without resistance. They were hollowing out my mind so that when the doctors looked at me, the diagnosis of severe cognitive decline would be ironclad, undeniable, and permanent. Nadine snapped the pill organizer shut with a sharp click that cut through the quiet night. She tucked the empty Ziploc bag back into her inner pocket, picked up the organizer, and turned toward the house. I shoved myself away from the window and retreated into the deepest shadow in the kitchen, pressing my whole body flat against the cold metal of the refrigerator. I held my breath and squeezed my eyes closed as the sliding glass door rolled open and she stepped in off the patio. Her footsteps were soft and unhurried as she moved through the darkness, passing within a few feet of where I stood. She walked back inside and set the pill organizer on the counter. I understood in that moment with absolute clarity I was not losing my mind. My own family was actively working to poison it. I stayed pinned against the refrigerator long after Nadine had gone for what felt like hours. My heart was pounding against my ribs in a hard, violent rhythm. The full weight of my situation pressed down on me like something I couldn't breathe through. I was not a grieving widower descending into cognitive decline. I was a target. My son and daughter-in-law were deliberately poisoning my mind in order to strip me of everything I owned. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay rigid in my bed, eyes on the ceiling, thinking through every move I would need to make. When morning finally arrived, pale light pushing through the blinds, I had my answer. I shuffled into the kitchen in my oldest robe feet, dragging every inch the frail old man they believed me to be. Nadine was at the Marble Island with a cup of coffee. She gave me a warm, cheerful good morning and slid the pill organizer across the counter toward me. My fingers were shaking as I picked up the small, toxic capsule. I raised the water glass, placed the pill on my tongue, and swallowed with an audible gulp. Nadine watched every movement, a flicker of dark satisfaction crossing her face as she convinced herself the poison had gone down. It hadn't. I had tucked the capsule smoothly beneath my tongue. The second she turned away to check her phone, I spit the dissolving pill into a paper napkin and buried it in my robe pocket. Derek came down the stairs a few minutes later, straightening his expensive wool blend tie. They kissed, tossed me a few hollow, patronizing words of comfort, and headed out the front door. I stood at the window and watched their luxury sedan back down the drive and vanish around the corner of the quiet suburban street. The moment it was gone, the act dropped entirely. My spine straightened. The mental fog that had been smothering me for weeks was already beginning to clear, giving way to the sharp, focused precision of a man who had spent a lifetime solving hard problems. I turned and walked straight down the hallway to Derek's home office. The room was immaculate, filled with modern minimalist furniture that Lorraine had always absolutely hated. Centered on his sleek glass desk sat his high-end, custom-built desktop computer. Derek had always been arrogant, but arrogance and intelligence are not the same thing. I was the one who had personally sourced and assembled every component inside that machine, a Christmas gift I had put together with my own hands. And more than that, I knew the deep grooves of how his mind worked. Derek believed he was always the sharpest person in the room, but he leaned on lazy, predictable habits. I settled into his leather office chair and touched the keyboard. The large monitor woke up, throwing a password prompt over a mountain ski resort background image. I didn't pause for a second. I typed in the name of his childhood dog and the year he graduated from business school. The screen unlocked, immediately opening up everything, every file, every folder, every corner of his digital life. My fingers moved fast. The first thing I had to confirm was the luxury care facility they had dangled in front of me like a promise. I pulled up his web browser and went straight to his search history. I filtered the past 3 weeks for anything touching elderly care premium, assisted living, or medical facilities, and I dug through hundreds of entries. There was nothing. Not a single search, not one click. The polished brochure Derek had left on the coffee table was a prop, nothing more than a piece of theater designed to keep me cooperative. I widened my search, going deeper into his recent browsing. What I found in its place made my jaw tighten. His history was saturated with research into offshore banking regulations, anonymous shell companies, and fast-track citizenship programs for Caribbean nations. He had burned hours poring over listings for beachfront estates in the Cayman Islands and comparing rates on oversized luxury yachts. The digital trail sketched a portrait of a man actively engineering his escape, taking a large sum of liquid cash with him when he went. I opened a new tab and punched through the thin security on his personal financial dashboard. The account summary that loaded confirmed every suspicion I had been carrying. Derek and Nadine were drowning. Multiple high-limit credit cards were maxed to the ceiling, blown on lavish travel designer clothing and expensive restaurants. But the single most alarming thing on that screen was a glaring final notice from an unregulated offshore lending firm. The document's language was aggressive and unambiguous. A delinquent loan balance of $800,000 long past due. They had poured everything into high-risk speculative investments that had collapsed entirely, leaving them exposed to the kind of people who do not accept excuses. This wasn't simple greed driving them to push me out. They were desperate cornered animals trying to outrun a syndicate that would not think twice about destroying them. They needed the $1.2 million from the sale of my house to clear that terrifying debt and bankroll their escape, leaving me to rot in some bleak, windowless, state-run facility. A cold, controlled fury settled into my chest as I minimized the financial dashboard. I needed to know how far along this plan actually was. I opened his email, client slipped past another weak password, and went directly to his inbox. I sorted by attachments and skipped past his routine work correspondence. What stopped me was a highly active thread between Nadine and an address I didn't recognize. No name attached, no domain I could place. The contact label simply read, broker, no agency, no professional signature, no logo. It had every mark of a shadow operator moving properties off the books fast and quiet. I scrolled down to the first message Nadine had fired off, sent late the previous night, right around the time I had watched her pacing the dark patio with her phone pressed to her ear. I read through what she had written, and my blood went cold. They were not stalling. They were pushing hard toward the final phase of this betrayal, and they intended to have it finished before the weekend. I stared at the screen reading Nadine's words to the unlicensed broker a second time. The message was short and stripped of any warmth whatsoever. She had written, "List the house 30% below market value immediately. We do not care about getting a fair price. We need the cash by this Friday. No exceptions. Do not worry about the current owner. The old man is too heavily medicated to know what he is signing anyway." The cruelty of it landed like a fist to the chest. She wasn't only scheming to take my home, she was openly mocking what she believed was my deteriorating mind, treating my life as a disposable means to her own survival. I sat in Derek's leather chair, with my hands gripping the armrests so tight that my knuckles went white. My own son, the boy I had raised with everything I had, every ounce of love and sacrifice, had brought this woman into our family. Together, they had carefully built a machine designed to strip away my dignity, my home, and whatever future I had left. They were prepared to dump me in a low-income facility with no windows just to bury their own catastrophic mistakes. The betrayal cut that deep like something jagged turning slowly in my gut. I read the email one final time, letting every word brand itself into my memory. I needed to feel this. I needed this fury to be the thing that moved my hands over the next 48 hours. I closed the email client carefully, making sure the read status on each message was left exactly as I'd found it. I cleared my own search queries from the browser, history erasing every trace of my presence, so Derek would have no reason to suspect his machine had been touched. I locked the screen, leaving the mountain ski resort background exactly as it was. I pushed up from the desk, my legs less steady than I'd have liked, under the weight of what I now knew. I walked out of the office and back into the wide, quiet hallway. The house felt alien to me, now hollowed out hostile. It was no longer the place where Lorraine and I had built decades of life together. It had become a battlefield. I needed a plan of attack, and I needed it fast. Friday was 2 days away. That left me fewer than 48 hours to tear their scheme apart and get myself to safety. I moved slowly across the remaining rugs in the living room, my mind working through legal angles and possible moves. I had the $400,000 in cash. I had the Montana ranch deed. The financial leverage was there, but I needed a legal weapon sharp enough and solid enough to actually use it. I was turning toward the kitchen to get some water when the front doorbell cut through the silence of the house without warning. Before we go any further, I want you to understand the weight of what I was about to discover, something that would reach far beyond stolen property or broken trust, something that cut right to the bone of what family is supposed to mean. So, let me ask you this. If you suspected someone close to you was quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait and gather every piece of proof first? I stopped dead in my tracks. Derek and Nadine were both at work. No deliveries were scheduled, and the movers had finished their preliminary packing the afternoon before. I made my way carefully toward the foyer, a sudden nameless dread beginning to tighten around my chest. I reached the heavy wooden front door and pressed my eye to the small, distorted glass of the peephole. On my front porch stood one of the most physically imposing men I had ever laid eyes on. He wore a dark canvas bomber jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, and his thick neck was blanketed in dense, aggressive tattoos. He had none of the look of a salesman, and nothing whatsoever of a friendly neighbor. He looked like raw, unfiltered violence with 2 legs. My hand hovered uncertainly above the brass deadbolt. I thought briefly about not answering, just standing still and waiting for him to lose patience and leave. Then the man drew back his fist and drove it into the solid wood door, the impact booming through the empty foyer like a battering ram. "I know you're in there," a deep, gravelly voice punched through the thick door. "Open this up right now, or I will kick the entire frame clean off its hinges." The air seized in my throat. I am a 70-year-old man. I keep myself in reasonable shape, but I am absolutely no match for a man that size with violence written all over him. Even so, I knew that cowering on the other side of a door like a frightened child was not going to get me out of anything. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the front door open slowly, keeping the sturdy chain lock fastened. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked, pressing every ounce of composure I had into my voice to keep it from shaking. The tattooed man had no interest in pleasantries. He drove his heavy boot into the base of the door with a single explosive kick, snapping the metal chain lock as though it were a piece of string. The door swung open violently, throwing me backward into the foyer. I stumbled and hit the hallway wall hard, my shoulder cracking against the decorative wooden molding with a burst of pain. Before I could draw a breath or get my footing back, he was already inside the house, pulling the front door shut behind him with a slam that shook the walls. He covered the distance between us in 2 long, predatory strides. A massive calloused hand shot out and grabbed me by the collar of my worn bathrobe, hauling me up off the floor and pinning me against the wall. His thick fingers dug into my collarbone like iron hooks. He put his face inches from mine. The smell radiating off him was stale tobacco and cheap cologne, harsh and suffocating at that range. He showed not the slightest recognition that I was an elderly man who posed no threat to anyone. His expression was cold and completely empty in a way that drove a spike of genuine primal terror straight through me. "You must be Derek's father," the man snarled, his deep voice thrumming with a low, terrifying menace. "You're going to carry a very important message back to your pathetic, cowardly son." I could barely breathe, my toes just grazing the hardwood floor as he held me pinned. "I don't know what you're talking about." I gasped, my hands instinctively closing around his thick wrists. The man let out a laugh, a harsh grating sound that contained absolutely nothing resembling genuine amusement. He pushed his face even closer, dark eyes narrowing into cold, dangerous slits. "Tell your son his offshore debts are officially past due." He hissed the words slowly, each one soaked in lethal intent. He thought he could bury his catastrophic losses, but we own him. You make sure he understands if we don't have our $800,000 in raw cash. By this Friday, we will be coming back. And if we have to make that trip, this entire house burns straight to the ground, with you locked inside it. He released his grip and let me drop heavily to the floor. I hit the hardwood on my knees, gasping, both hands pressed against my bruised chest. I stayed there for a long moment, just pulling air back into my lungs. I stared at the computer screen, my eyes moving across the brutal words Nadine had typed to the unlicensed broker. The message was short, cold, and stripped of any trace of human feeling. She wrote that they needed the house listed at 30% below market value without delay. She made clear they had no interest in a fair price, they needed the cash in hand, by Friday, no exceptions. "Do not worry about the current owner," she had typed, without the slightest hesitation. "The old man is too heavily medicated to know what he is signing anyway." The sheer cold-bloodedness of it landed like a fist against my sternum. She was not simply scheming to take my home. She was openly mocking the mental deterioration she believed she had engineered in me, treating my existence as nothing more than a minor administrative inconvenience standing between her and an escape route. I sat in Derek's leather office chair, my hands clamped around the armrests so tightly that my knuckles drained completely white. My own son, the boy I had poured every drop of love and sacrifice into raising, had brought this calculating, ruthless woman into our family. Together, they had built a plan designed to take everything from me, my dignity, my home, my future. They were prepared to dump me in a windowless, low-income facility just to paper over the wreckage of their own catastrophic choices. The depth of that betrayal felt like a jagged blade twisting slowly in my gut. I read the email one final time, pressing every word into permanent memory. I needed the burn of that anger. I was going to need it. I reached forward and closed the email client carefully, making absolutely certain the read status on every message remained untouched. I scrubbed my own search queries from the browser history, covering my tracks so thoroughly that Derek would have no reason to suspect his machine had ever been touched. I locked the desktop, leaving the mountain ski resort background image exactly as it had been. I pushed myself to my feet, legs slightly unsteady under the full, crushing weight of what I now knew. I moved out of the home office and back into the wide, quiet hallway. The house felt utterly hollow to me now, foreign in a way it had never felt before. It was no longer the warm sanctuary where Lorraine and I had lived and loved through so many decades together. It had become enemy ground. I needed a counterattack, and I needed to build it fast. Friday was only 2 days away. That gave me fewer than 48 hours to dismantle their scheme completely and get myself to safety. I started to pace the length of the living room, working through legal strategies and possible routes forward. I had the $400,000 in cash. I had the Montana ranch deed. The financial leverage was there, but raw resources meant nothing without an impenetrable legal structure wrapped around them. I needed the right weapon to make the strike count. I was just turning toward the kitchen to get myself a glass of water when the front doorbell suddenly rang out, splitting the heavy silence of the house. I stopped cold. Derek and Nadine were at work. No deliveries were scheduled, and the movers had wrapped up their preliminary work the afternoon before. I moved toward the foyer with slow, measured steps, an inexplicable dread climbing up through my chest with every stride. I reached the heavy wooden front door and leaned in to look through the peephole. Standing on my porch was an enormous, deeply menacing man. He had on a dark canvas bomber jacket over a plain gray t-shirt, and every inch of his thick neck was covered in dark, aggressive tattoos. He had nothing of a salesman about him, nothing of a neighbor. He looked like violence given a human shape. My hand drifted nervously toward the brass deadbolt and stopped there. I considered letting the silence answer for me. Maybe he would simply turn around and go. Then he pulled back a heavy fist and slammed it against the solid wood, the deep booming echo rolling through the empty foyer. "I know you are in there." A deep gravelly voice hammered through the thick door. "Open up right now, or I will kick this entire frame right off its hinges." My breath locked in my chest. I am 70 years old. I stay in decent shape for my age, but I am no contest whatsoever for a man that size with that look in his eye. Even so, shrinking back into the dark of my own home like a frightened old man was not something I was willing to do. I turned the deadbolt and cracked the front door open, slowly leaving the sturdy chain lock hooked and fastened. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked, pushing hard for a steadiness I was not fully feeling. The tattooed man dispensed with any pretense of civility. He swung his boot hard into the base of the door, and the chain lock gave way in an instant as though it were made of nothing at all. The door flew open and the force of it drove me back hard into the foyer. I stumbled my shoulder, slamming into the hallway's decorative wooden molding with a sharp crack of pain. Before I had even found my balance, he was inside the front door, banging shut behind him. He closed the gap between us in 2 long, deliberate strides. A massive calloused hand seized me by the collar of my bathrobe and shoved me up against the wall. His thick fingers bore down into my collarbone like clamps. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the stale tobacco and cheap cologne coming off him in waves. He showed no awareness whatsoever that I was an elderly man who posed no threat to anyone. He fixed me with a cold, dead stare that drove a spike of genuine primal terror straight through me. "You must be Derek's father." The man snarled, his voice thrumming with a low, terrifying menace. "You are going to carry a very urgent message back to your pathetic, cowardly son." I was barely able to breathe, my toes just grazing the hardwood floor as he held me pinned against the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about," I gasped, my hands instinctively closing around his thick wrists. The man let out a laugh, a harsh scraping sound, with no humor in it at all. He pushed his face even closer, dark eyes narrowing into dangerous, ruthless slits. "Tell your son his offshore debts are officially past due," he hissed, each word soaked in lethal intent. "He thought he could bury his catastrophic losses, but we own him. You make sure he understands if we don't have our $800,000 in raw cash. By this Friday, we are coming back here, and if we have to make that trip, this entire house burns straight to the ground with you trapped inside it." He released his grip and let me drop heavily to the floor. I gasped for air, clutching my bruised chest as my heart hammered violently against my ribs. The huge man turned, pushed the heavy door open, and walked out into the fading afternoon light without a single glance back, leaving me utterly alone with the full weight of what had just happened. I hauled myself up off the cold floor, aching from where he had driven me into the wall. The threat still hung in the silent foyer like something toxic. $800,000 by Friday, or the house would burn with me inside it. The window was impossibly tight, and the danger was entirely physical now. I knew I could not remain in Houston for another night. If I confronted Derek directly, his associates would silence me before I ever reached the authorities. I needed a safe position and an airtight legal weapon before I could make any move at all. I straightened my torn bathrobe and walked back to my bedroom. I packed a small duffel bag and pulled my heavy leather briefcase from the bottom drawer of my oak dresser. I needed a reason to leave the house that wouldn't raise any suspicion. When Nadine and Derek came home from work that evening, I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at a framed photograph of my late brother. I let my hands tremble visibly as they walked in. I looked up with wet eyes and told them I had been thinking hard about the nursing home. I told them I was ready to accept it, ready to move into the facility on Friday morning, but I had one request I needed granted first. I said I had to take a bus down to Louisiana to visit my older brother's grave and say a proper goodbye before I was shut away for good. Nadine could barely hide her relief. She agreed immediately, her eyes lighting up at the thought of having me out of the house during the critical days before the fraudulent sale was meant to close. She pulled out her phone and booked me a cheap bus ticket for the very next morning. She told me to take whatever time I needed, promising they would handle all the packing. They believed they were sending a broken, heavily medicated old man off on some pitiful final errand. They had no idea they were handing a seasoned engineer the precise window he needed to dismantle everything they had built. The following morning, Nadine dropped me at the downtown bus terminal. I embraced her goodbye, performing the role of the frail, defeated elder without a single slip. I waited until her sedan was swallowed by the city traffic. Then I crossed directly to the taxi stand and told the driver to take me straight to the international airport. I bypassed every commercial counter and used a private credit card that Lorraine and I had kept tucked away for true emergencies to pay for a direct flight to Montana. I boarded the plane with my leather briefcase held tight against my side. As the aircraft lifted above the clouds, the crushing anxiety that had been pressing down on me for days finally began to release. Hours later, I was standing at the edge of the vast property Lorraine had secretly left me. The Montana air was sharp and clean, a world away from the suffocating atmosphere of my home back in Houston. Before me stretched 5,000 acres of rolling plains framed by jagged mountain ridgelines. Out on the horizon, I could see the heavy machinery of the Mineral Corporation working steadily, generating $50,000 a month into a secure trust that my corrupt son knew nothing about. I pulled a long breath into my lungs, drawing something like strength from the sheer scale of that landscape. I didn't linger. I had fewer than 48 hours to execute my legal strike. I made my way into the nearby town, a quiet community built around the local mineral industry, and headed directly for the address Lorraine had noted in her hidden documents. The office belonged to Conrad Albrecht, a highly respected corporate attorney who managed the complex land leases for the estate. I pushed through the glass door into a sleek reception area and immediately asked to see Conrad, bypassing the startled receptionist entirely by stating my name and my connection to Lorraine's private trust. Conrad Albrecht was a tall, commanding man in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored suit that projected an air of efficient, no-nonsense authority. He welcomed me into his spacious corner office and offered his sincere condolences for Lorraine's passing. But I had no time for pleasantries. I lowered myself into the leather chair across from his wide desk and set my briefcase squarely between us. I released the brass latches and lifted the lid. I watched Conrad's professional composure slip for just a fraction of a second as his eyes landed on the $400,000 in bound cash sitting alongside the original property deed. I looked him straight in the eye and laid out the entire situation without softening a single detail. I told him about the forged power of attorney, the fraudulent nursing home brochure, and the unlicensed broker Nadine was using to rush the sale of my home. I walked him through my son's massive offshore debt and the violent enforcer who had threatened to burn my house down by Friday. I told Conrad that I needed to completely neutralize my son's legal standing, and I needed it done in under 48 hours. Conrad leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingertips together as he worked through the legal architecture I was proposing. A sharp, predatory smile moved slowly across his face. He told me my son had made a catastrophic mistake by assuming a forged document would hand him absolute control. Conrad moved with decisive speed. He called his senior paralegal into the office and began issuing rapid, precise instructions. We used a portion of the cash to immediately establish an invisible, heavily protected corporate entity. We named it Apex Holdings. Conrad structured the company through anonymous corporate proxies and blind trusts, ensuring my name would never surface on any public registration document. Apex Holdings was a ghost, a powerful financial entity capable of operating in total secrecy with complete impunity. Once the corporate structure was legally registered with the state authorities, Conrad slid a fresh stack of dense transfer documents across the mahogany desk toward me and placed a heavy gold fountain pen in my hand. He explained that a power of attorney, even a fraudulently notarized one, only gives the proxy authority over assets the principal actually owns. If the principal no longer holds ownership of the asset, the proxy has nothing left to sell. I pressed the pen nib to the thick parchment. Right there in his quiet, secure Montana office, I signed my name and legally transferred the entire deed of my $1.2 million Houston home completely out of my personal possession. I gifted the property directly into the protected corporate vault of Apex Holdings. I set the pen down, and for the first time in weeks, something that felt like genuine, overwhelming victory moved through my tired bones. The grief and fear that had been grinding me down for 3 weeks gave way in an instant to something cold, clear, and deeply satisfying. The trap was set armed and entirely inescapable. I had stripped them of the one asset they absolutely had to have in order to survive. Derek and Nadine were back in Houston right now, pushing hard with their shady broker, desperately trying to sell a house that I no longer legally owned. The flight back to Houston felt nothing like the desperate journey to Montana had. I was no longer a terrified, grieving widower, fleeing blindly from a threat closing in around him. I was a man returning to the battlefield with a loaded weapon and an impenetrable shield at his back. My mind was razor sharp the entire flight, turning over every legal instruction Conrad Albrecht had given me. But the moment the taxi rolled up to my suburban driveway, I understood I had to bury the engineer completely and bring the broken old man back to the surface. I let my shoulders drop. I slowed my breathing and dragged my feet across the concrete walkway. When I pushed open the front door, the house was utterly silent. Most of my belongings were already sealed inside sterile cardboard boxes stacked high along the living room walls. Derek and Nadine had wasted no time getting the property ready for its new buyers. They were huddled together at the kitchen island over a laptop when they heard the front door close, and they both immediately got to their feet. Nadine hurried over to greet me, her face fixed in that familiar, sickeningly sweet mask of manufactured concern. She lifted the small duffel bag from my hands as if I were made of something breakable. She asked how the visit to my brother's grave had gone, tilting her head in a practiced show of deep compassion. I kept my eyes trained on the floor and let my voice tremble just enough to convey total exhaustion. I told her the journey had taken a heavy toll on me. I muttered something vague about how much I missed Lorraine, rubbing my eyes to feign a wave of overwhelming weariness. Derek appeared in the hallway, arms folded across his chest, studying my face to satisfy himself that the poison capsules he believed I was still taking were keeping me suitably impaired. I gave him a weak, unfocused nod, playing the role of the heavily medicated victim without a single false step. "You look completely worn out, Dad," Derek said quietly, steering me by the elbow toward the living room. "You should really go lie down. But before you do, there's just one small piece of paperwork we need you to take care of. The broker found a wonderful family ready to buy the house, and we're closing tomorrow morning. We just need your formal sign-off to push the sale through." Nadine smoothly drew a thick stack of stapled documents from her leather portfolio, set a heavy brass pen on top, and slid everything across the glass coffee table toward me. I looked down at the bold printed heading "Consent to sell real estate property." My heart was hammering against my ribs, but not from fear this time. It was from pure, unadulterated irony. They were pressing me urgently to sell an asset that had already been transferred into a Montana corporate vault a full 24 hours ago. I reached out for the brass pen, making sure my fingers trembled visibly. I gripped the cool metal and held the nib above the signature line. I looked up at Nadine and Derek with wide, uncertain eyes, doing my best impression of a confused old man signing his life away. Nadine gave me a soft, reassuring nod. I put pen to paper. Instead of my usual neat, precise signature, I deliberately produced a messy, barely legible scrawl. I let the nib slide slightly at the end, drawing a clumsy streak of dark blue ink across the bottom of the page. It looked precisely like the shaky, uncoordinated mark of a man whose mind had largely given out on him. Derek snatched the document off the table, the instant my pen lifted. He couldn't fully suppress the flash of greedy satisfaction that crossed his face. He checked the messy signature, shared a look of deep mutual relief with Nadine, and tucked the papers carefully back into her portfolio. They both exhaled in the same moment. The biggest obstacle had been cleared. They genuinely believed they would be multimillionaires by the following afternoon. I eased myself slowly off the sofa, letting out a soft groan, and shuffled down the hallway toward my bedroom in my most convincing display of frailty. I pulled the door closed behind me, but didn't let it latch, leaving a small crack so I could catch whatever came next. Faint sounds drifted down the quiet corridor almost immediately. The distinct sharp pop of a wine cork, the soft clink of crystal glasses meeting in a toast, They were celebrating. They were pouring expensive wine and congratulating each other on their incoming wealth, completely blind to the massive, inescapable trap that had already snapped shut around their ankles. I sat still in the dark and waited for a full hour. I needed the house to go completely quiet. I knew they would eventually move upstairs to work through the final details of their escape plan. When I finally heard their bedroom door click shut on the second floor, I got up. I opened my duffel bag and removed a compact, high-quality micro-audio recorder I had picked up at a specialized electronics store in Montana. As an engineer, I have always had a deep appreciation for precision technology that does exactly what it promises. The device was no larger than a coin fitted with a powerful long-range directional microphone and a secure Bluetooth transmitter. I slipped out of the bedroom and moved silently through the dark, empty living room. Moonlight fell across the stacked moving boxes in long, angled shadows. I got down on my hands and knees and crossed the bare floorboards without making a sound. I reached the glass coffee table where I had signed the worthless consent form only hours before. I felt along the underside of the heavy wooden base, located a recessed groove, and pressed the adhesive back of the tiny recorder firmly into place. Completely hidden. Invisible from any normal vantage point in the room. I slipped back to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat down on the edge of the mattress. I drew the wireless Bluetooth receiver from my pocket and seated the small earpiece carefully in my right ear. The technology was flawless. The connection opened immediately, clean and silent, not a trace of interference. The digital clock on the bedside table burned red in the darkness. 2:00 in the morning, exactly. I stared at those numbers, a cold, focused wave of anticipation moving through me. I knew Derek and Nadine were under enormous pressure from their outstanding debt. I knew neither of them would manage any real sleep tonight. They would come back downstairs eventually to pace and plan. I settled my breathing, let the quiet of the suburban night close around me, and pressed my thumb to the small, glowing blue button on the side of the receiver. I held my breath. For just a moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of digital static. Then a crystal-clear audio feed poured into my right ear. The hidden microphone was exceptional. I could pick up the ambient hum of the refrigerator in the background. I could hear the distinct sound of wine being poured, followed by the sharp ring of crystal glasses tapping together. Derek and Nadine were seated almost directly above the concealed device. Their voices came through so crisp and close that they might as well have been in the room with me. I honestly cannot believe we actually pulled this off, Derek said, his voice carrying a mixture of deep relief and naked arrogance. I thought the old man was going to put up a real fight today. I thought he was going to want to read every single line of that consent form before he touched the pen. Nadine responded with a short, dismissive laugh. I told you there was absolutely nothing to worry about, Derek. You give him far too much credit. Your father has been completely checked out ever since we increased the dosage in his morning capsules. He could barely even hold that pen steady today. His signature looked like something drawn by a blind child. The broker didn't question it for even a second. He saw the ink on the paper and validated the transaction right there. I heard the soft thud of a glass being set down on the wooden coffee table. So, what does the timeline look like for tomorrow? Derek asked, his voice sharpening into something businesslike. When does the money actually land in the escrow account? We cannot afford any kind of delay with these cartel people. That enforcer was very clear that Friday is the hard deadline before things turn physical. The timeline is perfect, Nadine replied, her voice smooth and utterly controlled. The buyer is wiring the full $1.2 million directly into our joint offshore account by $9 tomorrow morning. The moment the funds clear the international holding period, I am transferring the $800,000 straight to the syndicate's routing number. That clears our entire debt in one shot. They will have their money a full 24 hours before the Friday deadline. The cartel backs off, and we are finally free. And the remaining $400,000, Derek asked, the greed coming through clearly in his voice. That is our fresh start, Nadine said with quiet confidence. I already have the tickets booked first class. We leave for the Cayman Islands on Thursday night. I locked in a beautiful private beachfront villa on a long-term lease. We can live like absolute royalty down there for years while we sort out our next big move. All we have to do is throw some things in a bag and walk out the front door. A brief, easy silence settled over the audio feed, as they both probably pictured the tropical getaway ahead of them. Then Derek shifted on the sofa. The leather groaned loudly through the earpiece. "What about Dad?" Derek asked, his voice completely empty of any warmth or family feeling. He sounded like he was talking about a busted piece of luggage that needed hauling to the nearest dump. "Are we still dropping him off at that low-income nursing home Thursday afternoon before we leave for the airport? We need him locked away somewhere secure so he can't wander into a police station and try to flag the house sale as fraud once the fog in his head starts to lift." Nadine let out a high, chilling laugh that drove a spike of pure ice straight down my spine. It was the sound of absolute predatory malice. "I canceled that nursing home reservation 3 days ago." "Derek," Nadine said, her voice thick with dark amusement, "that glossy brochure I left sitting on the coffee table was nothing but a prop, something to keep him calm and compliant. We can't take the risk of putting him in a standard assisted living facility. Even a badly underfunded nursing home lets patients make phone calls, have visitors, and eventually sit down with a social worker. If his heavy medication wears off and his memory snaps back, he could bring a world of legal trouble down on us from inside a nursing home." "So, where is he actually going?" Derek asked, sounding more curious than troubled. "I called the state psychiatric asylum." Nadine revealed, her voice cold and flat. "I used the forged power of attorney along with the annotated medical chart from Dr. Calloway to secure an involuntary permanent commitment order. They're sending a sealed medical transport van to collect him first thing Friday morning. By the time they show up to take him away, we'll already be sitting on a beautiful beach in the Cayman Islands." "The state asylum." Derek repeated, a flicker of genuine surprise creeping into his voice. "Isn't that a heavily restricted lockdown facility?" "Exactly," Nadine confirmed with ruthless satisfaction. "They deal in severe unmanageable dementia patients and violent psychiatric cases. The moment he's entered into their system, he becomes a permanent ward of the state. They strip away his personal clothing, his phone, his whole identity. They'll keep him heavily sedated around the clock to manage his so-called fabricated delusions. The ward I had him assigned to sits in the basement level of their oldest building. There are no windows at all on that ward, Derek. He will never see sunlight again. He will never have any way to reach the outside world and tell his sad little story. He will simply disappear." I sat alone in the suffocating dark of my bedroom, gripping the wireless receiver so hard the plastic casing bit painfully into my palm. The sheer raw evil of what they had planned was almost too enormous to take in. They weren't just making off with my home and fleeing the country. They were deliberately sentencing me to a living nightmare, condemning me to spend whatever years I had left locked inside a windowless concrete cell, pumped full of heavy sedatives, until my mind genuinely rotted away into nothing. My own flesh and blood had calmly signed my life over for a luxury holiday in the Cayman Islands. A deep, terrifying stillness came over me as I listened to them cheerfully clink their crystal wine glasses together in the kitchen. I had believed the very worst of their betrayal was already fully out in the open. I was certain there was nothing left in this world that could shock me further or crack my heart any deeper. But the hushed conversation threading through my earpiece didn't stop at their monstrous asylum scheme. The digital audio feed crackled faintly as Derek leaned in closer to his wife, dropping his voice to a tight, anxious whisper. The final devastating secret was about to fall into the silence, and it would shatter me completely. I sat on the edge of my mattress and pressed the earpiece harder into my ear, straining after every syllable. The ambient noise from the living room seemed to fall away, leaving nothing but the nervous creak of Derek shifting his weight on the leather sofa. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all of its earlier arrogant triumph. It was trembling thin and heavy, with a sudden suffocating paranoia. "What about Mom?" Derek whispered, the question hanging in the air like a thick poisonous fog. "What if Dr. Calloway ever says something to him? What if Dad ever finds out what we actually did?" My heart lurched violently. My breathing stopped. I sat frozen in the dark of my bedroom, my whole body going rigid with a primal instinctual dread. I had no idea what he was referring to. Lorraine had passed away from a sudden aggressive illness. It had been a tragedy, a devastating twist of fate that had shattered my world into pieces. There was nothing for me to find out. "Keep your voice down," Nadine hissed, her tone plunging instantly into a harsh, venomous warning. "Nobody is ever going to find out anything, Derek. You're letting your nerves completely get the better of you. Dr. Calloway is not going to say a word. He is bound by hospital confidentiality, and he genuinely believes we were simply honoring her advanced medical directives. But we weren't honoring her directives. Derek stammered, his breathing turning shallow and ragged. She was trying to communicate with the nurses. She was trying to stay awake. What if Dad ever requests the detailed medical logs? What if he finds out that we authorized the hospital administration to disconnect her ventilator 2 days early just so she couldn't sign her new will? The digital feed kept carrying their hushed exchange, but I could no longer make out the words over the deafening roar of my own blood pounding through my ears. The bedroom began to physically spin around me. I felt an enormous crushing weight slam into my chest, squeezing the air clean out of my lungs. I reached out and grabbed the edge of my heavy oak nightstand, fingers digging into the wood to keep myself from crumpling onto the floor. I closed my eyes, and a vivid, agonizing memory surged through my mind. I remembered the harsh, sterile glare of the fluorescent lights in the intensive care unit. I remembered sitting beside Lorraine's hospital bed, holding her thin, cold hand for hours. She had been weak, fighting a massive infection that was tearing through her body, but she had been fighting. I remembered the exact moment the attending physician drew me aside in the hallway and spoke to me quietly. He had looked at me with genuine sympathy and explained that her organs were failing completely, that keeping her on the ventilator was only prolonging her suffering. I had trusted every word of that assessment. I had wept without restraint, convinced that letting her go was the final merciful act of a man who loved his wife. I remember the cold chill of that hospital room as I held her hand one last time, asking her to forgive me for not being able to spare her the pain. I had kissed her forehead, told her how deeply I loved her, and stood in absolute agony as the nurses silenced the machines and let her slip away. But it was a lie. Every bit of it a carefully constructed, sickening lie. She was going to change her estate planning, Derek. Nadine said, her voice entirely stripped of any human feeling. She told me her attorney was coming to the hospital Thursday morning to draft a new living trust. She was going to lock the bulk of her liquid assets into a secure generation-skipping fund for any future grandchildren. She was going to cut off our direct access to the primary inheritance accounts entirely. We couldn't afford to let that happen. We needed that upfront capital to cover the first round of offshore margin calls. If she had gotten to sign those documents, we would have been completely finished. I know, Derek whispered, his voice shaking with a cowardice that turned my stomach. I know why we had to do it. But she was still my mother, Nadine. We walked into that administrative office, told them Dad was too emotionally compromised to make the hard medical calls, and we used our emergency proxy to sign the termination orders. We killed her. We did not kill her. Nadine snapped back, her tone radiating pure cold evil. Her body was already in failure. We simply moved the inevitable forward to protect our financial future. It was a difficult business decision, Derek, and it worked. We received the inheritance payout. We secured the house. And now we're heading to the Caribbean. You need to bury that guilt right now. The old man gets shipped to a windowless asylum Friday morning. There is absolutely no one left to ask any questions. I slowly opened my eyes. The suffocating wave of grief that had been pulling me under for 3 weeks dissolved into the cold, still air of the bedroom. The terrible, gnawing ache of losing my wife was instantly scorched away by a blazing, catastrophic inferno of pure rage. The white-hot fury surging through my veins was so overwhelming, it actually stopped my hands from shaking. My mind locked into a terrifying, flawless clarity. I was no longer a mourning widower. I was a man who had just uncovered a murder. I had spent my entire life working without rest to build a beautiful, comfortable world for my son. I had surrendered my own ambitions, grinding through punishing hours on dangerous oil rigs just to guarantee he never experienced a single day of real hardship. I had loved him with everything I had. But the man sitting in my living room drinking my expensive wine and mapping out a tropical escape was no longer my son. He was a monster, a cold, calculating predator who had joined forces with a sociopath to methodically tear his own family apart for money. They had weaponized my love for my wife. They had exploited my debilitating grief to slowly poison my mind, intending to seal me inside a concrete cell for the rest of my days, stripping away every fundamental right I possessed, just to bury their crimes. But that was only the secondary offense. The true depth of their depravity was something far worse than anything I could have imagined. The financial fraud, the fake nursing home, the stolen house, all of it went pale against the horrifying truth still ringing in my ear. My blood turned to ice. They had not simply abandoned me to escape a violent cartel debt. They had actively cut my wife's life short to secure their inheritance window before it permanently closed. She was brain dead, Derek. Nadine snapped on the recording, her voice carrying a sickening metallic hollowness that stripped away every last trace of her humanity. Keeping her alive on those machines was running us thousands of dollars a day in specialized care that insurance was already threatening to deny. She was never going to wake up, and more importantly, her dragging on gave us the perfect window to lock down the power of attorney, while your father was far too busy weeping at her bedside to notice what he was signing. We made the right call. We did what had to be done to protect our assets. I sat without moving in the suffocating dark of my bedroom. The earpiece fed her cold, calculated words directly into my mind, but they no longer hit like a blunt blow. Instead, they felt like a sudden plunge into freezing water. Every last shred of the grief that had pressed down on me for 3 weeks evaporated completely. The crushing sorrow of losing my wife was burned clean away by a cold, clinical, and absolutely terrifying clarity. I was no longer a grieving father. I was no longer a dazed, broken old man waiting to be hauled off to a windowless asylum. I was a structural engineer. I had spent 40 years of my career analyzing catastrophic failures, pinpointing weak points in massive offshore platforms, and systematically dismantling enormous structures under extreme pressure. I closed my eyes and let the analytical, predatory side of my brain fully come online. I stopped seeing Derek as my flesh and blood. I stripped away the decades of fatherly love, the memories of teaching him to ride a bicycle, the pride of funding his expensive business school education. I severed every emotional thread connecting me to the boy I had raised, reducing him and his ruthless wife to nothing more than a dangerous, unstable variable in a complex equation. They were a critical failure in the structural integrity of my family, a cancer that had consumed my life and murdered my wife for a quick financial payout. And just like any compromised failing structure, they needed to be meticulously, ruthlessly, and permanently demolished. I listened to the remainder of their hushed conversation with complete, unwavering detachment. Derek eventually stopped wringing his hands over his manufactured guilt, his shallow conscience easily soothed by Nadine's venomous reassurances. They drifted back to eagerly mapping out the layout of their beachfront villa in the Cayman Islands, debating whether to bring in a private chef or rely on local catering once they landed. They clinked their wine glasses one final time, the sharp ring of crystal sealing their monstrous pact. I heard the heavy creak of the leather sofa as they finally rose, followed by the soft pad of footsteps climbing the carpeted staircase to the guest room. I waited until I heard their bedroom door click firmly shut on the second floor. I reached up and slowly pulled the wireless Bluetooth earpiece from my ear, setting it down gently on the edge of the heavy oak nightstand. The silence that poured back into the room was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt alive, charged with a vibrant, lethal current. I stood up from the mattress. My joints didn't ache. My hands didn't tremble. I crossed to the large bay window and drew the heavy curtains tightly shut, making sure no stray light from the street lamps outside could reach my movements. I had a significant amount of work ahead of me before sunrise, and every step needed to be executed with absolute, unforgiving precision. I moved silently around my bedroom, packing a sleek leather overnight bag with the few essential items I'd need for the next 48 hours. I folded my crisp, tailored navy suit and laid it carefully into a protective garment bag. I chose a pristine white dress shirt and a deep burgundy tie. I was not going to face them the next morning, looking like a worn-out, broken victim. I was going to walk into that closing room, looking like an executive executioner. I retrieved my heavy leather briefcase from the bottom drawer of the dresser, confirming that the remaining bundles of cash, the official Montana Ranch documents, and the freshly prepared corporate records for Apex Holdings were completely secure. I locked the brass latches with a satisfying metallic snap. I spent the remaining hours of the night sitting perfectly still in a high-backed reading chair in the corner of my bedroom. I did not sleep for a single second. I rehearsed the coming confrontation in my mind, calculating every possible variable, anticipating every likely reaction from my corrupt son and his treacherous wife. I mapped out the precise timing of Conrad Albrecht's arrival, the strategic positioning of the federal agents, and the exact moment I would bring the heavy, inescapable hammer down on their entire world. I was going to dismantle their glamorous, deceitful lives piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there was nothing left but the shattering realization of their own catastrophic failure. The digital clock on my nightstand ticked steadily forward, its bright red numbers marking off the final hours of their stolen freedom. Eventually, the pitch-black sky beyond my window began to soften into a pale, bruised purple. The quiet suburban neighborhood stirred slowly awake, completely oblivious to the massive life-altering detonation that was nearly upon it. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps moving around on the second floor. The shower in the guest bathroom clicked on water, rushing loudly through the pipes inside the walls. Derek and Nadine were awake. I stayed perfectly concealed in the shadows of my locked bedroom, listening as they moved about with confidence, preparing for the most consequential day of their miserable lives. The rich smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted down the long hallway. I could hear Nadine humming a bright little tune as she moved around the kitchen island. They had absolutely no idea the trap was already closed tight around their necks. They were certain that today they would collect their stolen millions, settle up with the cartel enforcer, and step onto a first-class flight to a tropical paradise. While I decayed inside a dark concrete cell, the front door swung open and banged shut. I peered through the narrow gap in my bedroom blinds. The morning sun was sharp and clear. Derek and Nadine were striding with purpose down the concrete driveway. Both were impeccably dressed in sharp, tailored designer suits, carrying sleek leather portfolios, their faces radiating pure arrogance. They got into their luxury sedan and reversed out into the street, heading straight for the real estate broker's office to collect their final enormous payout. The moment their car swung around the corner and vanished from sight, I gathered my things, stepped out into the hallway, and got ready to follow. It was closing day, and I was going to make absolutely certain the final door slammed shut directly on them. I stepped out of the shadows of my home and made my way down the quiet suburban street to where I had left my rental car the night before. I slid behind the wheel and turned the engine over. I kept a careful, deliberate distance behind Derek and Nadine as their luxury sedan wound through the early morning commute toward the city. The drive took just under an hour, but it felt like an eternity suspended in pure adrenaline. I watched their vehicle thread effortlessly through the dense Houston traffic, drawing steadily closer to the downtown financial district. My hands sat steady on the steering wheel. There was no lingering sorrow. There was no crushing weight of a father on the verge of destroying his only child. The man behind this wheel was a structural engineer running the final calculations on a controlled, devastating demolition. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about that cold, sterile hospital room where they had callously silenced her life support to protect their greedy, desperate financial timeline. That single horrific image hardened the cold steel running through my spine into something permanent. They were going to pay dearly for every precious second they had stolen from her. They eventually turned into the underground parking garage of a sleek, modern high-rise planted squarely in the heart of downtown Houston. I parked a level above them, waited a few calculated moments, and rode the elevator up to the main lobby. The real estate brokerage occupied the entire 14th floor. It was an incredibly ostentatious office built from the ground up to project immense wealth and success to high-net-worth clients. The walls carried abstract modern art, and the floors were polished white marble that threw back the bright morning light flooding in through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I stepped off the elevator and positioned myself near a large decorative potted plant, taking in the reception area from a safe distance. Through the thick glass walls of the main conference room, I had a clear line of sight to Derek and Nadine. They sat side by side at a vast mahogany table. Nadine was nervously crossing and uncrossing her legs, one stylish heel, tapping in rapid little beats against the carpet. Derek kept glancing at his expensive gold wristwatch, his face a tight mask of barely restrained anticipation. They were waiting for the anonymous buyer to walk through the glass door and press a certified cashier's check for $1.2 million into their hands. They genuinely believed their nightmare was behind them forever. I drew my smartphone from my inner jacket pocket and checked the time. It was exactly 8:45 in the morning. The official closing was set for 9. I turned my attention toward the elevator bank at the far end of the marble lobby. The polished metal doors parted with a soft, melodic chime. Conrad Albrecht stepped out into the bright corridor. He wore an immaculately tailored navy blue suit and carried his sleek leather briefcase firmly in his right hand. He moved like an apex predator wading into a pool of completely unsuspecting prey. He spotted me at once and delivered a sharp, curt nod of the silent acknowledgement. We had spent the prior 48 hours coordinating this moment down to the very last detail. The instant he secured the legal transfer of my property into the impenetrable Montana corporate vault, he had contacted the appropriate federal authorities. Together, we had handed them undeniable concrete proof of the forged power of attorney, the attempted wire fraud, and the ongoing criminal conspiracy to sell a stolen high-value asset across state lines. This was no longer a messy civil family dispute over money. It was a massive airtight federal crime carrying severe legal consequences. I drew a long, steadying breath and smoothed the crisp lapels of my navy suit. I straightened my expensive wool blend tie, making sure my posture was absolutely commanding. I was no longer the hunched, shuffling, heavily medicated old man they had left behind in the kitchen barely 2 hours ago. I walked out from behind the decorative plant and moved with purpose across the gleaming marble floor. My polished dress shoes struck the stone in a steady rhythmic cadence, a measured march toward justice. I approached the glass-walled conference room with complete unwavering resolve. The young unlicensed real estate broker sat at the head of the long table, hurriedly sorting through a thick stack of closing documents. Derek and Nadine were leaning forward in their plush seats, eyes fixed hungrily on the frosted glass door, entirely prepared to welcome the wealthy buyer who was about to miraculously rescue their lives. I reached out and closed my hand around the heavy stainless steel handle. I turned it slowly and pushed the thick door open wide. The glass swung inward in one smooth, silent arc. I stepped into the bright conference room and let the door ease shut behind me with a soft, decisive click. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and absolutely unmistakable. The polished, welcoming smile on Nadine's face collapsed the very moment her eyes landed on my tailored suit. Derek lurched in his leather chair with a sharp, audible gasp, as if all the air had been driven violently from his chest. They stared at me in complete, undiluted horror. They were looking at a ghost. They were looking at the frail, heavily sedated old man they had been certain was locked away in a suburban kitchen, utterly unaware that he had become their worst possible nightmare. I did not say a word. I simply stood at the far end of the long mahogany table, posture perfectly straight, shoulders, squared hands resting quietly at my sides. I fixed my gaze directly on Derek. The raw, naked panic radiating from his pale, trembling face was deeply satisfying to watch. He opened his mouth to speak, to force out some desperate, fabricated explanation for why I was standing there, but his voice deserted him entirely. The silence pressing down on that room was absolutely deafening. The unlicensed broker swiveled his eyes between us, thoroughly bewildered by the sudden suffocating tension that had hijacked his lucrative morning. I watched Nadine slowly reach into her designer purse, her shaking fingers scrabbling for her cell phone. The realization crashing over her that their polished, flawless escape plan had just suffered a catastrophic and total collapse. She was frantically searching for any exit from the situation they had so recklessly built around themselves. But there was no way out from under the crushing weight of what they had done. I held my gaze firm, letting them sink fully into their own terror, and then the heavy stainless steel handle of the conference room door turned a second time. Behind me stood Conrad Albrecht, sleek leather briefcase in hand, flanked by 2 fully armed federal agents. The glass door clicked shut behind them, sealing the room like a vault. Derek sat frozen in his expensive leather chair, jaw hanging open as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. He looked from me to the federal agents and back again, chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid bursts. He tried to form words, but they dissolved into a stammering rasp. He raised his trembling hands and gestured wildly at the briefcase resting on the mahogany table, demanding to know what was happening, his voice fracturing under the weight of his sudden panic. He shot a desperate look at Nadine, silently begging her to manufacture some clever lie, but she was utterly frozen. Every trace of the imperious authority she had carried just 10 minutes ago had drained completely away, leaving nothing in its place but raw, undisguised terror. The unlicensed broker shoved his chair back hard, the metal legs shrieking against the polished floor. He thrust both hands into the air in full surrender, rapidly insisting he had no idea what was unfolding and was nothing more than an independent contractor. He swore he knew absolutely nothing about any criminal activity. Conrad Albrecht paid the panicking broker no attention whatsoever. He crossed the room with a calm, predatory ease toward the head of the long conference table, his polished dress shoes silent on the thick carpet. He set his leather briefcase on the smooth mahogany surface and popped the brass latches with a crisp snap. He reached in and produced a thick, meticulously organized legal file. He did not look at Derek or Nadine with any trace of anger. He regarded them with the cold clinical detachment of an exterminator assessing a serious infestation. He dropped the heavy file onto the center of the table. The dense stack of papers slid across the polished wood and came to rest mere inches from Nadine's trembling hands. Conrad straightened his tailored suit jacket and cleared his throat, drawing the complete attention of every person in the room. When he spoke, his voice carried a deep, resonant authority that left absolutely no room for doubt. "Allow me to formally introduce my client." He began gesturing with quiet respect in my direction. "You may know him as your father, but in the professional financial sector, he is recognized as the sole proprietor and acting chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." Derek stared at Conrad in profound confusion, his brow deeply furrowed as his panicked mind desperately tried to connect the dots. He repeated the name Apex Holdings out loud, the unfamiliar corporate title landing like ash on his tongue. Nadine swallowed hard, her dark eyes darting frantically toward the thick file resting on the table. Conrad offered them a sharp, humorless smile. He calmly explained that Apex Holdings was a privately managed investment firm, carrying significant liquid capital available for immediate deployment. He stated that earlier in the week, Apex Holdings had used its corporate channels to make contact with a specific unregulated offshore lending entity. Conrad leaned forward and placed both hands flat on the mahogany table. "Apex Holdings just legally purchased your delinquent $800,000 debt directly from the underground syndicate via secure corporate channels." He announced, letting the full weight of those words settle over the silent room. "We bought your paper at a premium to guarantee a rapid, unquestioned transfer of financial liability. The dangerous men who were threatening to burn you alive are no longer looking for you. You no longer owe them a single dime." For one brief, agonizingly foolish moment, a wave of profound relief washed across Derek's pale face. He actually believed I had stepped in to save his miserable life. He thought the pathetic, forgiving father he had spent years manipulating had come rushing in at the very last second to pull him back from the edge of his own catastrophic mistakes. He let out a long, shaky breath and lifted his eyes to mine, fresh tears beginning to well in them. But Conrad Albrecht was far from finished delivering his perfectly timed sequence of devastating blows. He reached out and tapped one finger sharply against the top page of the legal file. "However," Conrad continued, his voice dropping into a lethal, icy register, "because Apex Holdings absorbed your financial liability, we are now your sole exclusive creditors, and we require immediate repayment in full." Nadine finally found her voice, though it came out brittle and thin as dry leaves. She jabbed a trembling finger at the closing documents fanned across the table and declared aggressively that they were closing on the house right then and would have the cash to cover the debt in under an hour. Conrad let out a short, sharp laugh that held absolutely no warmth. He shook his head slowly and regarded Nadine with something close to genuine pity. "That is where you have run into a massive, insurmountable legal problem," he said smoothly. "You cannot legally sell a property you do not actually own." The blood drained instantly from Nadine's face, leaving her looking physically ill. She stammered that she held a valid, notarized power of attorney that explicitly granted her husband the legal right to liquidate his father's primary estate. Conrad nodded in polite agreement, acknowledging that under different circumstances her forged document might have functioned perfectly. But a power of attorney only applies to assets currently held in the principal individual's name. "Mr. Gerald," Conrad continued, his voice carrying an air of absolute finality, "legally transferred the entire deed of his suburban Houston property out of his personal name nearly a month ago. He gifted the entire estate into the impenetrable corporate vault of Apex Holdings. We own the house. You have spent this entire morning aggressively attempting to sell an asset belonging to a private corporation." The full devastating reality of their situation crashed down on them like a collapsing concrete ceiling. Nadine sank back into her leather chair, breath coming in short gasps as the invisible noose drew impossibly tight around her neck. She stared down at the forged consent forms she had presented to the broker with such confidence just minutes ago, suddenly grasping that they were not her passport to a tropical paradise, but her signed confession to a serious crime. Derek began shaking violently, burying his face in his trembling hands and letting out a low, wretched moan of pure despair. The unlicensed real estate broker quietly snatched his personal briefcase and made a move toward the back door, but the two armed federal agents stepped forward and sealed off his only route of escape. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a hard expression, reached into his dark suit jacket and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking rang out ominously through the tense, silent conference room. The agent looked squarely at Derek and Nadine and spoke with the full, terrifying weight of the federal justice system behind every word. By attempting to sell an asset they did not own, using a forged power of attorney document across state lines, they had committed first-degree federal wire fraud. There was no escape from the permanent consequences of what they had done. The steel handcuffs snapped shut around Nadine's wrists, the sharp sound cutting cleanly through the stunned silence of the room. Her legs gave out beneath her. She lurched against the edge of the mahogany table, a raw, guttural noise tearing from her throat, as the federal agent firmly pinned her arms behind her back. All of her arrogant composure, every calculated cruelty she had carried for years, dissolved in an instant. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the cage door had just been locked permanently. Derek did not try to run. He did not attempt to fight. He simply crumbled. He dropped heavily to his knees on the polished marble floor, his expensive suit wrinkling around his shaking frame. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders heaving, as deep, pathetic sobs tore through his chest. The full weight of his own destruction had finally broken something inside him. He raised his eyes to mine, his face streaked with hot tears, his expression wild with desperate, pleading terror. "Dad!" Derek cried out, his voice splintering into a high, hysterical pitch. "I am so sorry. Please, you have to stop this. You cannot do this to us. I am your son." I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. I searched my heart for 1 ounce of pity for any surviving trace of a father's instinct to protect. I found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel. When I finally answered him, my voice carried no emotion at all. "This house stopped being yours a month ago." I said, each word landing like a slow, heavy blow. "And you stopped being my son the exact day you walked into that hospital and unplugged your mother's machine." Derek let out a horrific, agonizing wail. He knew in that precise moment that I had heard the recording. He knew his darkest, most unforgivable act had been dragged fully into the light. The second federal agent hauled him to his feet and secured his wrists in cold steel. Derek strained toward me with outstretched hands, begging for a mercy he had absolutely no right to expect, but the agents pulled him firmly away. Nadine was weeping without restraint, her makeup running down her pale face in dark, streaking lines as she was marched out through the glass doors. I stood perfectly still and watched them being walked through the crowded real estate lobby in handcuffs. The unlicensed broker sat rigid in his chair, completely paralyzed by the magnitude of the federal action that had just obliterated his lucrative morning. He stared down at his trembling hands, fully aware that his own illegal business practices were about to come under serious scrutiny. The receptionist in the outer hallway gasped aloud, scattering a stack of white papers across the floor as the agent steered Derek and Nadine toward the main elevator bank. Every person in that building was watching them, their glamorous lives finished in a single devastating moment. They were stripped of the arrogant facade they had worn for years, utterly humiliated, in front of the very crowd they had always sought to impress. Conrad Albrecht stood quietly at my side, methodically packing his legal files back into his sleek leather briefcase. He closed the brass latches with a firm, definitive snap and gave me a silent nod of deep mutual respect. We walked out of the conference room together, leaving the shaken broker alone at the table behind us. The nightmare was finally over. The cancer had been cleanly and permanently cut out of my life. Fast forward exactly 3 months later. The air out here in Montana is incredibly crisp and clean, untouched by the suffocating smog of the city. I am standing on the wide wooden porch of the vast ranch that Lorraine secretly left me, leaning gently against the sturdy railing. The morning sun is just beginning to lift above the jagged mountain peaks, casting a brilliant golden light across 5,000 acres of open green plains, stretching as far as my eyes can reach. In the distance, a small herd of pronghorn antelope grazes peacefully near a winding creek. The heavy machinery of the mineral corporation continues its steady rhythmic work on the horizon, quietly securing my financial independence. I do not feel lonely out here in this vast open space. I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom. The legal fallout back in Houston came swiftly. It was crushing and absolutely devastating for them. Derek and Nadine are currently sitting in federal holding facilities, awaiting a criminal trial that will inevitably land them in a maximum security prison for decades. They push for leniency, but the audio recordings and the paper trail of their massive offshore debts handed the prosecution an airtight, inescapable case. The underground cartel enforcer who threatened my life was swept up in a sweeping federal raid coordinated by the authorities using the intelligence Conrad had gathered. The dangerous syndicate was completely dismantled, removing the final lingering threat from my life permanently. As for the house in the Houston suburbs, I knew I never wanted to set foot inside those walls again. The memories had been too deeply poisoned by their greed and betrayal. Rather than selling the property for profit, I directed Conrad to execute a legal transfer of the deed to a highly respected local charity. The sprawling 5-bedroom home has since been fully renovated and officially converted into a free full-time medical clinic and safe haven for elderly individuals who have been abandoned or abused by their own families. The very place where my son plotted to discard me is now a shelter of hope and healing for people who genuinely need it. That felt like the perfect ultimate victory over his dark intentions. I take a long, slow sip of hot black coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste anchor me in the present moment. I look up at the wide, endless blue sky and watch a solitary hawk riding effortlessly on the morning thermals. A gentle breeze sweeps across the porch, stirring the leaves of the old oak tree standing near the front steps. I close my eyes and let the quiet stillness of the ranch settle over my tired soul. For the first time since that terrible day in the hospital, the crushing weight of grief has lifted completely. I no longer feel broken. I feel entirely whole. I smile knowing I honored her remarkable legacy by protecting myself and delivering the justice she deserved. I draw another breath of the clean mountain air, and for the very first time in months, I can actually feel Lorraine standing right beside me. We are together again in spirit, watching the brilliant sunrise stretch across the vast, magnificent Montana landscape. I know she is deeply proud of the hard choices I made to defend our family's honor. The long, painful chapter of betrayal is finally closed forever. A brand new, profoundly peaceful chapter of my life has begun, and I am ready to embrace every moment of it. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love should never blind you to the truth. When you spend your whole life sacrificing for your family, it becomes dangerously easy to overlook the glaring signs of entitlement and pure greed. But real wisdom arrives with age and the hard-won understanding that trust must be earned, never simply assumed. Evil has a way of wearing the familiar face of the people we love the most. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, I want you to know how much that means to me. Thank you for listening. This one was not easy to tell, and I suspect it was not easy to hear. When I look back on everything Gerald walked through, the slow poisoning, the forged signatures, the truth about Lorraine's final hours, what strikes me most is not the scale of the betrayal. It's how long love kept him from seeing it. He had spent a lifetime building something for his family, and the very people he built it for were quietly dismantling him. I believe God places certain moments of painful clarity in our lives, not to destroy us, but to redirect us towards something more honest and more free. For Gerald, that clarity came late, but it came in time. Here is what I take from his story, and what I hope you will carry with you. Pay attention to patterns, not just moments. One strange thing can be explained away. A string of them cannot. If someone benefits greatly from your confusion did not happen by accident. Protect your mind. Love is not the same as trust. Give love freely, but make trust something that has to be earned over time. And never sign anything while you are grieving. The people who rush you in those moments are rarely on your side. These are the kinds of father stories that don't make headlines, but they happen in quiet houses every single day. Gerald's story is a dad's revenge in the truest sense, not vengeance for its own sake, but the reclaiming of a life that was nearly stolen, piece by piece. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't yet, I'd be honored if you subscribe to His Hidden Revenge. There are more stories here waiting for you. Leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. I read every single one. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.